If you confronted the average person on the street with a chalkboard of physics equations, or if you asked them to interpret Finnegan's Wake, they'd really have no idea what to do with it. But even I, who lacks any specific knowledge of music theory, can take a song like this in and experience it and disentangle. I mean, I might not be able to pick out all of the specific notes or instruments, but it'll all cohere together in my head. I might be able to, if there was a mistake, I would notice it immediately. And what are some of the key aptitudes that the human brain has, and what are the underlying structural features that enable this sort of processing of something so complex?
Great question. We know to the extent that the average person knows the name Noam Chomsky, apart from the fact that you interviewed him, it's because of an idea that he had some 50 years ago, that we're all born with an innate capacity to learn language, an innate language module or faculty or capacity. The word module has sort of fallen into disfavor in cognitive science, as you know. But I don't mind using the word module. It's got intuitive appeal. And, there really were people who thought, in the Middle Ages that, well, Chinese people are going to speak Chinese, and even if you separate them from their Chinese-speaking families and environment. And that's not true. We learn language through osmosis and this innate language module. And the same is true for music. There's an innate music module, and babies go through a period of musical babbling where they're playing around with pitch and melody and rhythm in the same way that they play around with speech sounds. And so by the age of 3 to 5, any infant who's heard music basically understands the rules of the syntax of its culture's music. So a 5-year-old will recognize that a note is out of tune, or that a note is out of place, or that a rhythm is out of place. And so that's the fundamental capacity we bring to music, that understanding that if I said to you, Robinson, if I said the pizza was too hot to sleep, you'd recognize an anomaly there, and you recognize musical anomalies in the same way. And I think beyond that, the more we listen, the more we build up expectations about what is supposed to happen in a piece of music. And I was influenced greatly by Doug Hintzman, cognitive psychologist who was a student of Gordon Bauer. I was Bauer's student first, and then I went to work with Hintzman. And Hintzman and a guy named Stephen Goldinger together cemented this theory called the multiple trace memory theory, which is an old idea of the Gestalt psychologists going back to the 1880s, that the way they put it was every experience you have leaves a residue in memory. And we don't talk about residues in the brain anymore, but Doug Hintzman and Stephen Goldinger talk about everything that you experience leaves a trace in your memory, in your brain somewhere. And even if, to the extent it seems that it doesn't, it's because, well, it's kind of hard to get at it. We have problems with memory access cues, and there's a bottleneck and a bunch of stuff crowds to get out, and a lot of memories aren't distinctive. If I ask you what you had for breakfast on June 3rd, 2017, you probably don't remember, because breakfasts aren't that distinctive unless that was like some, important day in your life and an important breakfast or something, right? So the memories can be in there without us having access to them. And I say all that because when we listen to music, any piece of music, it's invoking to some extent every piece of music we've ever heard before, and the piece of music we heard just before, and something that this reminds us of. And there's this whole categorization system going on where you go, oh, well, I don't know what kind of music that is, but it's, to take my song, Too Many People, you may not be able to say, oh, well, that's I'm not exactly sure what that is, but it's not country. It's not a Gregorian chant. It's not Chinese opera. It lives somewhere in the, poppy, rocky space of Woodstock era granola rock boomer guys or something, or maybe a little bit of an 80s, whatever it is. You've got some sense that it reminds you of things. And so you can bring to music listening all of that richness of experience. And you were talking about awe at the beginning. My friend Dr. Keltner at Berkeley just wrote a really interesting book called Awe, about the state of awe. I think the more you know about something, the more you can experience awe. It's bringing that Zen mind, beginner's mind to something you know a lot about. And you peel back the layers of the onion and you realize the great beauty and complexity that's there. And that's when awe hits.
I'd like to go back to this parallel between language and music that you mentioned, which is just so neat. The pizza is too hot to sleep is a great example. It reminds me of this sentence that I can't remember that Chomsky invented to make a similar point.
Pull this change, ungloved hand, no boundary?
That's not the one that I was thinking of. The one that I was thinking of, I think sleeps furiously or something is in there somewhere.
Yeah, I forget what that one is. I'm familiar with it too, yeah.
Yeah. But since you bring up Chomsky, there's a major debate about the innateness of language, or rather the origin of the innateness of language. And I think Chomsky's on one side of this debate. Maybe Pinker is on the other side. But the question is whether or not language is a faculty that evolved sort of directly through natural selection, or whether it is a spandrel in the sense that it's a byproduct of something that wasn't directly selected for. So I think the chin is an example that comes up often as something that might be a spandrel. So maybe the chin that the human has, I don't know the precise etiology of the chin, but I think the argument might be something like it's just a byproduct of how our jaws formed. But what I was wondering is...
That's meaning to the phrase taking it on the chin, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And what I was going to ask, though, is if you have a particular stance on this debate as it relates to music, whether you think music is something that was specifically evolved for in humans, or if it just was a byproduct of maybe the way that we learn to process other sounds or language or something like this.
Steven Pinker and I famously have been in contention about this.
Oh, really? Okay.
So,
I'm glad I stumbled upon it.
I like Steven and we get along just fine. And we recognize that this is a point of contention, but we're civil about it and it doesn't affect our friendship. But in, I don't even remember what year it was. I wrote about it in Brain on Music, but now the year escapes me. It might have been 97. The annual meeting of the music cognition group was held at MIT. And Stephen was invited to be the keynote speaker. And I think it was in Memorial Auditorium, big room that seats maybe 350, 400 people, to the best of my recollection. But I do remember that I was sitting with David Huron on one side of me and Ian Cross on the other, two great music cognition scientists and theorists. And Pinker takes the stage, and he had much success as a popular writer, and people want to know what he thinks. And he says, I don't really know what it is any of you do, and I haven't read any of your papers, but here's why I think all of you are wasting your time. He says, music is nothing more than auditory cheesecake. It's a trick on the brain that fools the brain into thinking that it's getting something nutritive, in the way that cheesecake fools evolutionary biology that led us to prefer sweets and fats. Because over evolutionary timescales, sweets and fats weren't readily available in the environment. It took a lot of work to find them. And if you found them, you might as well, store up on them. Now you can walk to the pantry, you can pull out a Twinkie and or go to the fridge and pull out cheesecake, and it tickles all those same circuits that were designed for something else. And he says that's all music is doing. It's tickling these circuits that were designed for other things, such as language. And I remember Erhardt and Cross saying, "Them's fighting words." I think they said it in their best Bugs Bunny, "Them's fighting words." And it launched a very productive series of experiments on the evolutionary basis of music, led by Erhardt and Cross. Stephen Meithen got involved with his book, The Singing Neanderthals. Three-author big volume set came out on MIT Press that I have here somewhere on the evolutionary origins of music. And the problem is we don't have a Wayback Machine, so we don't really know. But some of the evidence, none of which is conclusive, is that when we do brain scans, in my lab and in others, we find that the circuits devoted. So I'll back up and say we talk less about brain regions now than we did 10 years ago. We talk about circuits because things tend not to be so localized as we used to think. They're distributed circuits. But when we do brain scans of people listening to music or listening to speech and we contrast them, the music circuits appear to be phylogenetically, that is, evolutionarily older. And then we see evidence for this in Alzheimer's patients who will lose the ability to recognize anything going on around them. They'll forget names. They'll have trouble finding words, but they don't have trouble with music. We saw with Gabriella Giffords, Congresswoman Giffords, after she got a bullet in the left hemisphere and lost the power of speech, she could still sing. And in fact, she learned to sing using melodic intonation therapy. So the idea that music exists in older circuits is intriguing. We've got neurochemical circuits that respond to music, which doesn't mean they're not co-opting, because heroin and cheesecake co-opt pleasure circuits. But it's intriguing. It was a student of Roger Shepard, Jeffrey Miller, who argues that evolutionarily, music was important for mate selection as an honest signal to signal neurological fitness, because in evolutionary times, if you were making music, you were dancing. And this went on for hours and hours and hours. And by honest signal, we mean you can't fake it. You can't pretend that you can dance for 6 hours and pretend that you don't have a neurological condition if you do. And so you're signaling genetic fitness to a potential mate with music-dance.
Why does music processing, or the structures that are responsible for music processing being deeper or older in the brain, suggest that it was evolved?
So because the brain built out in layers, we started with what we now call reptilian brain, which was for locomotion and homeostasis. And the brain builds out from that core, layers and layers and layers. In fact, cortex means bark, like the bark on a tree, an outer layer. So what we think of as the seat of human thought, the cortex, is actually a layer. Parts of the cortex have 7 layers. Maybe there are more now that they've discovered. It's an evolving field. But the idea is that the brain builds outward. And so if something is older, it was there first. And so that's why it matters. If it was there first, that tells us maybe it evolved first.
I see. And just this is an aside, but as I listen to you, I'm struck by the quality of your memory for strings of words, like Chomsky's sentences, or even what Pinker said on the stage. But do you happen to think that this is something that was inadvertently trained by all your time spent listening to, writing, and memorizing songs, or it's just an ability you've always had?
Oh, well, it's really an illusion, Robinson. It's
Okay.
my professor, the late Lee Ross, did this wonderful work on what he called the fundamental attribution error. It's a big concept of social psychology. It's wonderful. And the idea is that we tend to attribute, when we observe a person's behavior, we tend to attribute the behavior that we see as part of some stable trait, some personality trait or ability, when it may be profoundly influenced by the situation they're in. And so you take a situation like this, Lee said, where a professor is pontificating on a stage, or in a podcast for that matter. I'm only talking about stuff that I remember and that I know about. I can cover vast areas of ignorance by simply not talking about them. And the few little things that I can pull out make you think I can pull out anything. It's kind of a weird magic trick. And what got Lee interested in this was that he was, when he was when he first got his doctorate, these professors around the table for his oral exam were peppering with questions, and he couldn't believe how smart they were. But a year later, he's sitting at Stanford on an oral committee as an assistant professor, grilling some hapless student. And the role gave Lee no opportunity to display any ignorance because he's asking the questions. Whereas the role of student, he's hopelessly tied to displaying ignorance because people can ask him anything. So I take the sentiment with which you offered the compliment, and it's meaningful to me. But I'm aware of the vast areas of ignorance. I don't think I have any special skills for pulling things out.